Welcome to Ecology Matters, a podcast from the Ecological Society of Australia, featuring ecologists from all over the country.
The biodiversity in this part of the world is just incredible.
It's not just ice and snow, it's teeming with life on the coast.
I see that and I say, okay, well, that's a great opportunity to study it more.
Looking at those sites gives you a sense of joy and hope.
Love being around, it's incredible.
It's just, it's a really awesome program, and it's just so healing, like for our whole community.
It's the beauty of ecology is that it's so interconnected.
Yeah, it's been really exciting actually.
Emilie Ens is an associate professor at Macquarie University, where she leads the cross-cultural ecology and environmental management lab. She's passionate about creating respectful cross-cultural partnerships with Indigenous people and organisations to better understand and manage Australia's diverse ecosystems. Emilie and her team have won a number of awards for their cross-cultural work, including Banksia, Eureka and Australian Academy of Science Awards. And in 2022, Emilie was awarded the ESA Members Service Prize in recognition of her outstanding contributions to Australian ecology. Could you just explain in your own words what cross-cultural ecology is and why it came to be such a central part of your career focus?
Okay. So to me, I guess thinking about cross-cultural ecology, what does that mean? First we think about ecology and what that is understanding the sort of interconnections within the environment, inclusive of humans. So when we look at cross-cultural ecology, we're understanding those interconnections from different cultural perspectives. So mainly I've been working in the sort of, Western science and Indigenous knowledge from those perspectives. And then with our cross-cultural ecology work, we combine those perspectives to understand, as you said, a whole range of different sort of environmental topics, challenges, questions. And I guess with our work, we're focusing largely on work with Aboriginal ranger groups on Aboriginal land. So we try to focus on questions and topics that are of interest to local traditional landowners.
And how did you yourself come to be so interested in it? How did you get involved in this if it wasn't originally your background?
Yeah, no, I often wonder what happened there. And really the story goes that after my PhD in Wollongong on invasive plant ecology with Chris French, I embarked on my first postdoc at CDU, Charles Darwin Uni, following a similar theme, looking at invasive grass ecology, gamba grass, in Northern Australian savannas. And it was through that experience, I guess my eyes were sort of open to Indigenous land management on a bigger scale than what I'd seen before, being based down in New South Wales. So I started thinking about sort of Indigenous land management more and teaching myself about, what that meant, because it was absent from my sort of undergraduate and postgraduate training up until then. And so I just think, hold on a minute, there's a different way that we can sort of tackle these environmental challenges, not just focusing on sort of quantitative Western ecology sort of methods, but also drawing in Indigenous knowledge and expertise. And that's when I started thinking about cross-cultural ecology and combining different approaches. And then I was just lucky enough really to stumble across a postdoc position that was advertised through the Australian National Uni as part of a multidisciplinary research team down in Canberra, based in the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research. And that's really what sort of kick-started my career in cross-cultural ecology and learning sort of a range of multidisciplinary techniques where we can sort of draw on those techniques to better understand and capture different sort of cultural perspectives around Indigenous land management. So it was a big sort of 90-degree turn, I guess, in my career, because up until then I was largely sort of focused on, pretty much, classic sort of plant ecology research and a bit of plant chemistry and that sort of stuff. And then I started thinking more about humans. So that was, a big thing for me, away from the lab and the microscope and starting to talk to people. But, it really, as you may know, has transformed sort of what I do these days and sort of encourage others to do. until now it's sort of become, a real movement across Australia that we are working more respectfully with Indigenous landowners and incorporating Indigenous knowledge and working respectfully with Indigenous people. So, I feel really lucky and privileged to be part of this shift in Australian ecology.
Mm. And you mentioned there that during your undergraduate studies there didn't seem to be much of a focus on Indigenous ecological knowledge. Do you think, as you mentioned, there's been a bit of a shift recently? Has that shift happened within universities as well in terms of the teaching material? Is it being introduced to undergraduates now?
We're getting there. I recently had a master's student, Wiradjuri master's student, Renee Cawthorne. She did a review of Indigenous science units across Australia in the faculties of science, in particular not the arts sort of faculties, the sciencey ones. And there was admittedly a fairly low sort of percentage of universities that had full units on Indigenous land management or science content. But I think there's been a dramatic shift. We do see it there, but we'd like to see more, obviously, and more Indigenous academics as well teaching about Indigenous ecological knowledge and concepts of caring for country. So we just still have a long way to go. But we're getting there. We're getting there, definitely. Yeah, there's definitely been a shift. A lot of interest. I get a lot of people asking me, how do you do it? How do we, bring more Indigenous content into our ecology units? Even just yesterday, someone asking me from Macquarie. So here at Macquarie, we're actually developing a bit of a strategy across our whole school, looking at where unit conveners want to include more Indigenous knowledge and coming up with a sort of a school-wide strategy across our multiple degrees and 63 subjects to see how we can scaffold Indigenous ecological knowledge and Indigenous voices across all of our units. So there's a deliberate effort, which is good by universities, I think.
And many of the partnerships that you have formed over the last decade or so have taken you into Arnhem Land and to North and West New South Wales. Why are those areas in particular of interest to you?
Yeah, really just, I guess, by chance or maybe say luck, or maybe you could, my Aboriginal colleagues would say, it was always meant to be that, the old people brought you to us in Arnhem Land. And that was my first the postdoc at ANU. I went into the multidisciplinary research team that already had established partnerships in Arnhem Land. My previous boss, Professor John Altman, he'd been working in Maningrida since the 80s. So I sort of piggybacked on his work and followed him around and sort of learnt how things work out there. And I've maintained those relationships and sort of involved projects out there ever since. And I guess, because of that, the relationships, and this is why, people know me, I always cry, but when I think about some of the really special people and elders that I've met over that time, who really influenced my thinking and inspired me to keep going and create new ways and bring new people into this space so we can transform how sort of environmental management's done in Australia. Yeah, so Arnhem Land just has a very special place in my heart. I still work there, spend about half the year there. But also, I guess, recognising that, Arnhem Land is a very special sort of particular place. It was declared, Arnhem Land is quite, it's quite large. It's like 5 times the size of Kakadu National Park. It was declared an Aboriginal reserve in 1931. So it was sort of protected from outside influence. There's, a lot of language and culture has maintained its integrity without the severe impacts of colonisation. Whereas down south in many other parts of Australia, we do see very significant, everyone knows, significant impacts of colonisation on cultural transmission and language. So I guess I took it upon myself to learn more about what these impacts are down south in New South Wales and try and work with Indigenous people from, closer to home for me in Sydney and see how we could do things sort of in this context where we have different challenges of, far smaller kind of parcels of Indigenous land ownership and all of the sort of conflicting demands on people's time and, I guess, dilution of Indigenous people within the broader, population down here in Sydney, the dilution of Indigenous voices in decision making, all present a whole new suite of challenges to sort of elevating cross-cultural ecology in this space. So, it's an ongoing challenge, as you probably know, all the politics and all that goes with it. But, it's very worthwhile.
And do you find that the types of projects that you work on in those two locations, are they quite different from each other, or do you find that there's a lot of crossover in some of the projects that you're focusing on?
Very different, I would say. I think it's the long relationships I've got in Arnhem Land, and also the places where we work. So small, remote Aboriginal communities and small Aboriginal ranger groups managing big, Indigenous protected areas is very different to down in New South Wales, where we still have small Aboriginal ranger groups, but they're usually working on much smaller parcels of land and have very different sort of challenges. So the scale is one big difference. So big scale in the NT, smaller scale down here. In the NT, we also have, I guess, the sort of computer literacy and English literacy is much lower than down in New South Wales. So we have those sort of challenges when we're trying to do collaborative monitoring and reporting and stuff like that. It's quite different. So we do a lot of sort of multilingual communications and using multimedia. And, we've developed new apps and stuff like that are bilingual and use images instead of text to try and overcome some of those challenges. Whereas down south, we can do some more kind of, sophisticated scientific stuff alongside Indigenous knowledge recording. I guess one of the big focuses of our work is, we want to try and maintain the balance between Western science and Indigenous knowledge and sort of work on the co-design sort of principles, and even starting to shift towards, Indigenous leadership. We want to see Indigenous people leading these projects. So I guess I'm sort of working in this sort of cross-cultural capacity building space as well, where I'm working with Indigenous people to sort of help train up in use of computers or whatever, but also non-Indigenous people learning about Aboriginal knowledge. So there's capacity building sort of on both sides. So there's differences in those sort of ways, working in Northern Territory, New South Wales.
And you mentioned there about the capacity building amongst non-Indigenous ecologists as well. What sort of guidance or advice would you give to non-Indigenous ecologists wanting to create partnerships and learn more about their Indigenous colleagues?
I think the biggest thing for us, being trained in the sort of Western scientific discipline, in very kind of rigorous ways, and where we have to conform to sort of statistical rigor and all those sorts of things, really can make ecology quite rigid. And when we're going to engage with Indigenous partners, I think the most important thing is to kind of let a bit of that go. We're going to have to compromise between, if we want to balance the different knowledge systems, which we can't always have the most sort of technical scientific approaches because our Indigenous partners simply just can't understand or don't value them the way we do. So trying to find some middle ground where there's mutual benefit. So both parties are getting something out of it. We both understand what each other are doing. So it's like a social learning process. And this kind of, I think, requires just letting go a bit of the power and the control that we have as sort of, as white fellas, privileged white fellas in Australia. Letting go and letting our Indigenous partners drive the projects and direct where we're going, what we're doing, can be really challenging for some people, especially when we have tight funding timeframes and reporting requirements that sort of push us to go faster, do things more efficiently. That doesn't always work with our Indigenous partners. So letting go of some of that, you really just sort of sit down and listen and work on Aboriginal time in a different way, so we can make some of these cross-cultural approaches really work in practice and work to protect our environment.
Ecology Matters is a podcast by the Ecological Society of Australia, a not-for-profit organisation supporting ecologists and ecological science in Australia. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. To learn more about our work, follow us on social media, visit our website or sign up to our newsletter. You can find links to these in the show notes. The theme music is Glow by Scott Buckley. Lastly, thank you to all the ecologists who have taken part in this series and shared their perspectives on why ecology matters.